Nicholas Reed stood at the edge of his marble balcony, gazing down at the city that once made him feel invincible. Manhattan stretched below in a blur of lights and motion. Stock tickers rolled across giant screens, sirens echoed faintly in the distance, and the city pulsed with life. But in his chest, there was only stillness, a heavy, unbearable silence that echoed louder than the world outside. He was one of the richest men in the country, tech visionary, investor, philanthropist. Magazines called him the brain behind the billion, and his innovations had revolutionized the way people interacted with AI and digital learning platforms. But no article ever mentioned his son. 6-year-old Liam Reed was his entire world now. 2 years ago, a car crash had turned Nicholas's life into a recurring nightmare. His wife, Clara, had been the kind of woman people wrote poems about. Gentle but fearless, kind but fiercely intelligent. That rainy night in Boston had stolen her away forever. Liam, only 4 then, had survived. But barely. He had suffered a traumatic brain injury, multiple spinal fractures, and was now confined to a wheelchair, his speech reduced to strained syllables and occasional gestures. Nicholas didn't cry at Clara's funeral. He didn't cry when he saw Liam's lifeless eyes in the ICU either. He cried the night Liam called him Ma instead of Dad. That was when he knew grief had rewritten his child's world. The mansion felt colder than it ever had. Technology controlled every inch of it, from temperature to lighting to security. But no AI could fill the void left behind. Nicholas tried to be everything for Liam: father, mother, therapist, playmate. But the demands of his empire wouldn't wait. Meetings, mergers, deadlines, they kept pulling him away from his son. Liam needs someone when you're gone, his sister Elise had urged. Hire a caregiver, someone who'll give him what you can't. Nicholas hesitated. He didn't trust easily, especially not with his most fragile treasure. But reality didn't give him choices anymore. That evening, he opened his laptop and sent out a job listing. Full-time caregiver for 6-year-old child with mobility and communication challenges. High discretion required. Live and preferred. Generous compensation. He received over 100 applications in 48 hours. Only one stood out. Her name was Sophie Blake. 28 years old. A pediatric nurse with a background in special education. Glowing recommendations from hospitals, schools, and former employers. But what caught Nicholas's attention was the handwritten note she attached to her resume. I know what it's like to feel broken. Not just physically, but inside. I don't offer sympathy, I offer understanding. I believe Liam deserves more than just care. He deserves connection. There was something raw and real about her words. Nicholas called her in for an interview the next day. Sophie arrived at the mansion in a modest coat, her auburn hair tucked into a messy bun, and her brown eyes alert but soft. She didn't flinch at the grandeur of the estate, or the intimidating presence of Nicholas. She looked him in the eye and said, I'm not here for the paycheck. I'm here for Liam. Nicholas wasn't sure whether to be impressed or suspicious. Tell me, he asked, folding his arms. Why did you really apply? She hesitated, then reached into her bag and pulled out a photo. A little boy, no older than 5, smiling on a hospital bed. My younger brother, Caleb. He was born with cerebral palsy. We were inseparable. I helped raise him after our parents passed. He died 3 years ago. Since then, I've tried to help children like him. Kids who just want someone to understand their silence. Nicholas nodded slowly. You'll have full access to the home. Liam has his own suite, a therapy room, medical assistants on call. There will be cameras in every common area, for safety. Sophie didn't even blink. I understand. Nicholas hired her that night. Liam was hesitant at first. He didn't like strangers. He didn't like loud voices or sudden movements. He rarely smiled. But Sophie didn't come in with expectations. She sat near him without pressing. She read to him with gentle expression. She played music, brought in therapy toys, and even planted a small indoor garden near his room with his help. And slowly, Liam began to respond. He smiled. He laughed, quietly, but it was real. He reached out to touch her hand. He even began forming clearer words, small ones, like yes, more, and Sophie. Nicholas watched the transformation with guarded hope. For the first time in years, there was warmth in the house. Liam was happier. And Sophie, she was good. Too good. But Nicholas had been burned before. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford anymore. And so, late one night, Nicholas walked into his private study, sat in front of his security monitors, and did something he told himself he wouldn't do. He reviewed the footage. The screen flickered to life. There was Sophie entering Liam's room in the early morning hours. Liam had apparently cried out in his sleep. Sophie rushed in, picked up a soft blanket, and whispered softly into his ear, stroking his hair. "Sha, I'm here. You're safe." Nicholas leaned in closer. Sophie then did something unexpected. She sat by his bedside and began telling a story, one Nicholas had never heard before. A story of a boy who couldn't walk but could fly in his dreams. A boy who lost his voice but could speak through music. A boy who changed the world not by standing, but by loving. Nicholas watched Liam's fingers curl into hers. His lip trembled. The scene cut off. And for the first time in years, Nicholas Reed cried. Nicholas didn't sleep that night. He sat in the dark, in his leather armchair by the study window, still wearing yesterday's suit, his mind spinning with 1,000 thoughts that wouldn't settle. The image of Sophie holding Liam's hand, whispering stories into the early morning hush, was burned into his memory. There was no deceit in her eyes, no performance for the camera, just pure, unfiltered compassion. And for Nicholas, that was terrifying, because it meant letting someone in again. He had done that once before, with Clara, and the pain of losing her had made him build walls so high, even he couldn't see over them anymore. The world expected him to be strong, sharp, unshakable. But what they didn't see was the man who woke up every morning praying his son would smile again, who blamed himself for not being behind the wheel that night, who hadn't told anyone, not even Elise, that Liam sometimes called out Clara's name in his sleep. Trusting Sophie wasn't just about hiring a nanny. It was about admitting that he couldn't do this alone. Morning sunlight spilled across the hardwood floors, catching the edge of a framed photo on his desk. Clara holding Liam as a baby, her smile soft and radiant. Nicholas ran a finger across the glass, then picked up his phone and texted Elise. "She's staying." There was no need for explanation. Later that day, Sophie brought Liam out to the garden. It was a crisp, early autumn morning. Leaves floated down like confetti, and Liam was bundled in a navy blue sweater, his small hands gloved and resting on the arms of his wheelchair. Sophie knelt beside him, holding up a leaf. "This one's red," she said gently. "Red means change is coming." Liam looked at her, his lips twitching slightly. "Cheesh, change." He tried. Sophie's eyes lit up. "Yes, baby boy. Change." Nicholas watched from the window, unseen. Something stirred in his chest, something like pride, but deeper. Liam hadn't tried a new word in weeks, and yet here he was, reaching toward the future with small, brave fingers. That evening, Nicholas invited Sophie to stay for dinner. It was the first time they sat across from each other without any professional filter. The dining room was quiet, save for the soft clinking of silverware. "I saw the footage," Nicholas said finally. Sophie paused, setting her fork down. "You said there were cameras. I wanted to make sure," he admitted, "that you were who you said you were." She met his gaze without flinching. "And what did you see?" Nicholas took a breath. "I saw someone doing more for my son in 2 weeks than I've managed in 2 years." Silence stretched between them like a fragile thread. "I don't want him to be just another case," Sophie said softly. "Liam's not broken. He's just waiting for the world to catch up to him." That night, Nicholas dreamed of Clara. She was standing by the garden, barefoot in the grass, holding Liam in her arms. She looked at Nicholas and smiled. "You can let go now," she whispered. "You're not alone." He woke up with tears on his face. In the weeks that followed, life inside the Reed mansion began to shift. It was slow, subtle at first, but undeniable. Sophie introduced a therapy dog named Moose, a gentle golden retriever with an uncanny ability to sense when Liam was overwhelmed. The boy lit up around him, laughing in broken syllables that melted everyone who heard. Nicholas took time off work, something he hadn't done in over a decade. He started joining Liam's therapy sessions, sitting on the floor with picture cards and soundboards, celebrating every word, every gesture, every breakthrough. There were setbacks, too. Days when Liam screamed in frustration or refused to eat. Nights when he cried for Clara, clutching her old scarf to his chest. But Sophie never wavered. She was patient, consistent, always present. One stormy afternoon, Liam had a full meltdown during speech therapy. He threw his communication device across the room, tears streaming down his face. No, talk," he cried, hitting his chest. No. Nicholas rushed in, panicked, but Sophie held up a hand. "Let him feel it," she said gently. She sat beside Liam and took his hand. "I get mad too, Liam," she whispered. "Sometimes I cry, and that's okay. Talking is hard, but feeling means you're alive." Liam curled into her, sobbing into her shoulder. Nicholas turned away, his jaw clenched. It hurt to see his son in pain. But it also showed him something he'd never realized. For Liam, Sophie wasn't a caregiver. She was a lifeline. That night, Nicholas opened a drawer in his study. He hadn't touched its contents since Clara passed. Inside was a small journal, a gift she'd given him on their first anniversary. The cover was worn, the leather faded. On the first page, in Clara's handwriting, were the words, "Write the truth, even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts." Nicholas picked up a pen. He wrote for the first time in years. About Liam. About the accident. About his guilt. And about Sophie, the stranger who had walked into their lives with open hands and no expectations, and somehow changed everything. Days turned into weeks. Autumn deepened. Halloween came, and Sophie dressed Liam as a tiny pilot, complete with goggles and a leather cap. She decorated his wheelchair like a plane. Nicholas laughed when he saw it, an honest, belly-deep laugh that startled even himself. Then, one quiet Tuesday afternoon, everything changed again. Nicholas had a board meeting and had to step out for a few hours. As always, the cameras were on. He glanced at them from his phone between meetings, just a quick check, a habit by now. But one of the feeds caught his eye. It was from the nursery. Not Liam's, but the guest nursery across the hall. Sophie was inside, talking to someone. Nicholas frowned and tapped to unmute the audio. Sophie was cradling a stuffed bear, tears in her eyes. "I miss you, Caleb," she whispered. "I wish you could see Liam. He reminds me of you, the way you used to look at the stars and tell me you'd fly one day. I still believe you did." She sat the bear on the rocking chair and kissed its head. "I promise I won't fail him." Nicholas stared at the screen, emotion rising in his throat. He'd thought he was the only one carrying ghosts. That night, when he returned, Sophie was in the kitchen, baking with Liam. The scent of cinnamon filled the air. Nicholas leaned against the doorway, watching them. "You talk to him," he said quietly. Sophie froze. "The cameras. I'm not upset," he said quickly. I didn't know." She wiped her hands on a towel. "Caleb was my brother. That nursery was for him once. I keep that space in every home I live in. It helps me remember why I do what I do." Nicholas stepped forward. "You don't have to carry it alone." She looked at him then, and for the first time, something passed between them that had nothing to do with contracts or caretaking. It was human, raw, real. They were two people trying to build something out of the ruins. Neither said anything else that night, but something had shifted again. The walls were cracking, and through the cracks, light was beginning to pour in. The first snowfall came earlier than expected that year. It blanketed the city in silence, soft and unassuming, as if nature itself had decided to slow everything down. In the Reed mansion, the world was no different. Outside, everything was white and still. Inside, everything was slowly coming back to life. Liam sat by the bay window, his tiny hands pressed against the cold glass, watching the snowflakes swirl in the wind. Sophie was beside him, humming an old lullaby that Nicholas recognized but couldn't place. Her voice was low, almost hypnotic. Liam tilted his head toward the sound, a sleepy smile tugging at his lips. Nicholas stood a few feet away, arms crossed loosely, just watching. There was something sacred about this moment, and he didn't dare interrupt it. He'd noticed the change in himself lately, how his instinct to control, to micromanage, was giving way to something softer. It had started small. He no longer checked the cameras every night. He didn't hover during therapy sessions or question every spoonful Sophie fed Liam. He had begun to trust her not because she'd proven herself perfect, but because she'd shown up every single day with patience, warmth, and something more difficult to name. Maybe it was grief. Maybe it was love. Nicholas wasn't sure yet, but he knew it was real. He spent more time at home now, declining international trips and shifting boardroom meetings onto Zoom. His investors didn't understand it. His assistant, who used to schedule him down to the minute, now found entire afternoons blocked off with just one label: Liam time. And for the first time in years, Nicholas didn't feel guilty for putting his son first. On one especially quiet morning, as snow coated the garden paths, Sophie approached Nicholas in the hallway, a folded letter in her hand. "It came for Liam," she said softly, handing it over. It was from the school district. Nicholas opened it slowly, eyes scanning the page, then stopping, shocked. They had accepted Liam into the district's special education inclusion program. After months of evaluations, assessments, and paperwork Sophie had quietly filed in the background, Liam had been given a chance to start school again. On his terms, with support, therapy, and aides trained to handle his needs. Nicholas looked up, stunned. "You did this." Sophie smiled, her eyes damp. "We did it. You said you wanted him to have a normal life. This is a step." He didn't speak for a moment, just held the letter to his chest. But something shifted again that day. The idea of Liam being out in the world, away from the mansion, was terrifying. Nicholas had built this house like a fortress, one designed to protect, not exclude. But now he had to face a truth he hadn't been ready to accept. Liam couldn't be kept hidden forever. And maybe, just maybe, he didn't need to be. The preparations began quickly. Sophie worked with occupational therapists and speech specialists, liaised with the school, and coached Liam gently each day to prepare him for the transition. Nicholas joined her, reading stories about classrooms and teachers, showing Liam pictures of other children, helping him understand what school meant now that his world was expanding. But with every step forward came a wave of fear that Nicholas couldn't suppress. What if the other kids laughed at him? What if the teachers didn't understand his cues? What if he cried for Sophie or asked for Clara? Nicholas didn't realize he'd said the last thought aloud until Sophie gently touched his arm. "If he asks for Clara, that means he's carrying her with him," she said. "That's not something to fear, Nicholas. That's something to honor." He looked at her, really looked at her, and in her eyes he saw not only strength, but pain. A pain she had turned into purpose. He nodded once, letting the silence carry what words could not. Then came the day of Liam's first visit to the school. They didn't call it enrollment or a first day. They called it a warm welcome. The school had arranged for Liam to meet his assigned aide, a soft-spoken woman named Grace, who communicated with visuals and sign language. The classroom had a ramp, sensory tools, and an entire corner decorated like a space shuttle, Liam's favorite obsession. Nicholas wheeled his son down the hallway, Sophie walking beside them. Liam's eyes widened with every new detail: the bright murals on the walls, the chatter of other children, the scent of crayons and disinfectant, and cafeteria food all mixed together. "Scared?" Nicholas asked softly. Liam looked up at him, paused, then nodded slowly. Nicholas crouched down, took both of his son's hands, and said, "Being scared means you're about to do something brave." Liam stared at him for a long second, then whispered, "Brave." Nicholas's throat tightened. He kissed Liam's forehead. Sophie gave him a quiet thumbs up from behind. They stayed for an hour, watching Liam interact with a small group of children. Grace introduced him to a communication board on the wall and a little girl named Ellie who used a walker. They played a matching game. Liam giggled once, just once, but it echoed louder in Nicholas's heart than any sound he'd heard in years. On the drive home, Liam was quiet, staring out at the snow-covered sidewalks. Then, just as they pulled into the driveway, he whispered, "I like Ellie." Sophie turned around in her seat, grinning. "You do." Nicholas laughed, a sound of both surprise and joy. The next few weeks were filled with more visits, more progress, and new rhythms. Liam began attending school twice a week, then 3 times. He brought home art projects, new words, and once even a video message from Ellie saying, "Hi Liam, you're cool." But then came the night Nicholas had feared more than anything. It started with a call from the school. Liam had had a panic attack during a group activity. Too much noise, too much movement. He'd shut down completely, silent, unresponsive, terrified. The teachers had done their best, but it had taken them half an hour to get him to calm down. Nicholas drove to the school like a man possessed. When he arrived, Sophie was already there, holding Liam in the quiet office. His face was buried in her shoulder, and he flinched when Nicholas entered. Nicholas dropped to his knees beside them, his voice cracking. "Liam, it's okay. I'm here. I'm here." But Liam wouldn't look at him. That night, back at home, the house was silent again. Nicholas sat on the edge of Liam's bed, watching his son sleep, his tiny fists clutching the stuffed airplane Ellie had given him. "I thought we were ready," Nicholas said to Sophie, who stood at the doorway. "I thought I was ready." Sophie stepped inside, sat beside him. "Progress isn't a straight line, Nicholas. There are good days and hard days. Today was hard, but tomorrow might not be." Nicholas looked at her, defeated. What if he's never ready for the world? Sophie reached over and took his hand. "Then we changed the world, not him." It was the first time she touched him without it being about Liam. Nicholas didn't pull away. In fact, he leaned into it. And suddenly, the silence between them wasn't empty. It was filled with everything they hadn't yet said. Outside, the snow began again. Inside, the healing continued. The days after Liam's panic attack were unusually quiet. Not the kind of quiet that came from peace, but the kind that hung heavy, uncertain. Nicholas noticed it in the way Liam withdrew slightly, hesitating before speaking, even with Sophie. He still went to school, but only after long pauses and deeper breaths, like a tiny soldier preparing himself for battle. Nicholas hated it. He hated the way fear lingered like a shadow behind every hopeful step. He hated how helpless he felt, watching his son struggle in a world that moved too fast, too loud, too everything. But most of all, he hated that he didn't know how to fix it. He built companies from the ground up, bought and sold empires with a handshake, controlled markets, predicted trends. But this was his son's life, and no amount of money, strategy, or power could control it. One evening, after Liam had finally fallen asleep, Nicholas found Sophie in the kitchen, cleaning up the mess from dinner. There were noodles on the floor, crayon marks on the counter, and a pile of broccoli Liam had refused to touch. Nicholas leaned against the doorframe, arms folded. "You should go home," he said gently. Sophie looked up, confused. "Why? You've been here 14 hours today. You're more than his nanny now, Sophie. You're his person. But you need rest too." Sophie dried her hands and walked over to him. "I don't stay because I have to, Nicholas." There was something unspoken in her voice, something tender, almost vulnerable. Nicholas nodded, not sure what to say, then did something he hadn't planned. He reached out and tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear. Her breath caught slightly, and neither of them moved for a moment. But then the silence was interrupted by a sound, soft, subtle, but unmistakable. Liam was crying. Nicholas rushed up the stairs with Sophie close behind. They found Liam sitting up in bed, trembling. His blanket was balled in his lap, tears streaming down his cheeks. His communication device lay unused beside him. "I'm scared," he whispered. Nicholas didn't hesitate. He scooped his son into his arms, holding him tight. "You're safe, baby. You're home." Sophie knelt beside them. "Was it a dream?" Liam nodded. Nicholas gently rocked him. "Tell me what happened." Liam struggled with the words. "People. Loud. And I couldn't find you. I called, but no one came." Nicholas closed his eyes, swallowing the ache in his throat. "You found us now," Sophie whispered. "And we came." Liam's arms wrapped tightly around Nicholas's neck. The boy buried his face in his father's chest and didn't let go for a long time. That night, Nicholas sat awake again, this time in Liam's room, watching his son sleep. He thought of the words Liam had said. "I called, but no one came," and he realized something painful. That dream wasn't just about the school. It was about the accident, about Clara, about all the moments Nicholas hadn't been there because he didn't know how to be. The next morning, Nicholas made a decision. It started with a call to his therapist, then a meeting with Liam's school, and finally a family session, a difficult one, where Nicholas finally told Liam what he hadn't been able to say in all these years. That night, the night Mommy went away. "I wasn't there, Liam. I was supposed to be, but I wasn't. And I'd hated myself for that every single day." Liam looked at him, wide-eyed. Nicholas reached for his hand. "I thought that if I just worked harder, earned more, built a bigger life, I could protect you from ever being hurt again. But I didn't realize I was keeping us both locked away." Sophie, sitting beside Liam, put her hand over his. "Your daddy loves you more than anything in this world. That's why he's learning to be brave too." Liam's lips quivered. He placed his small hand over his father's. "I love you, Daddy." Nicholas broke. In the rawest, most unguarded moment of his life, he cried. Not the silent, composed tears of a man used to hiding pain, but the sobs of a father finally letting go. After that, everything changed. Not overnight, not dramatically, but deeply. Nicholas began attending therapy weekly. He even joined a support group for parents of children with special needs, where he met other fathers, CEOs, plumbers, teachers, all united by love and the overwhelming fear of failing their kids. Sophie, encouraged by Nicholas, began writing again, journaling her experience with Liam, the challenges, the victories. Her words were raw and honest and beautiful. Nicholas read every entry she shared with him, often more than once. One afternoon, as winter began to melt into early spring, Sophie and Nicholas sat on the back porch, watching Liam and Moose play in the snow. Liam had figured out how to throw snowballs using a special catapult Sophie had designed with help from a 3D printer. His giggles echoed through the yard. "I never thought I'd see him like this," Nicholas said, his voice low. "You didn't just see it," Sophie replied. "You made it possible." Nicholas turned to her. "So did you." Their eyes met, and this time they didn't look away. There was something inevitable about it, something unforced. Sophie reached for his hand, And he met her halfway. No words were needed. It wasn't about filling Clara's place. It wasn't about replacing grief with romance. It was about two people who had been broken by life in different ways, and who had found each other, not because they were whole, but because they finally didn't have to pretend to be. The next day, Liam brought home a drawing from school. It was a stick figure family, 3 figures standing beneath a bright yellow sun. One had long hair. One was tall with glasses. One sat in a wheelchair with a big smile. Above it, in shaky letters, was one word: home. Nicholas hung it in the hallway where everyone could see. And for the first time in years, he knew what that word meant again. Spring moved in gently, like a shy guest knocking softly at the windows of the Reed mansion. The snow melted in patches, revealing the muddy earth beneath, and small bursts of green began to appear in the garden. First just shoots, then full blossoms, as if the world had decided it was time to begin again. And it wasn't just the world outside that was changing. Liam's world was blooming too. He had started speaking in fuller sentences, his words still halting at times, but filled with more clarity and confidence than ever before. His wheelchair didn't slow him down. He'd mastered it like a pilot controls a jet, speeding down hallways with laughter trailing behind him. At school, he had been chosen as a classroom helper, and on his first day in that role, he had proudly handed out pencils with an intensity that could rival a presidential assistant. Nicholas was there for it all, not through a screen, not through second-hand reports. He was there in person, in the moment. There were drop-offs and pickups, therapy appointments and doctor visits, and perhaps most unexpectedly, afternoons spent baking with Liam and Sophie, flour dusting every surface like snowfall in the kitchen. Nicholas had even learned how to make Liam's favorite, blueberry muffins with extra sugar. He burned the first batch. The second came out raw. But by the third, Liam had declared him Muffin King, and Nicholas wore that title like a crown. Yet even amidst the joy, life had its way of reminding them that healing wasn't a straight path. One afternoon, while organizing a few of Clara's things in the attic, Nicholas found something he hadn't seen in years. A journal. Clara's journal. It was weathered at the edges, the leather soft with time, and inside were pages and pages of her neat, delicate handwriting. Thoughts, dreams, notes about Liam, love letters never sent, memories scribbled down in the middle of sleepless nights. Nicholas sat there for hours, flipping through it, his heart growing heavier with every word. One entry stopped him cold. April 5th. I worry Nicholas won't know how to show Liam love in the way he needs. He works so hard, loves so deeply, but he hides it behind walls. I just hope that if I'm not here someday, someone will help him tear those walls down. His breath caught. Sophie. The thought came without hesitation, without fear. Sophie had done exactly what Clara had hoped for, gently, patiently, without force or expectation. She hadn't tried to replace anyone. She had simply shown up, day after day, heart wide open. And that night, Nicholas knew it was time to speak the truth. They sat on the porch again, Liam asleep upstairs, the air warm with the scent of new grass and honeysuckle. Nicholas handed her the journal. She wrote about you before she knew you. Sophie blinked, startled. What do you mean? He opened to the page, pointed. Sophie read it, slowly, then placed a hand over her mouth. She was worried about me, he said. And she was right. I was too lost in grief to see what Liam needed, and I didn't think I deserved a second chance at getting it right. Sophie's voice was barely above a whisper. But you took it. I did, he said, eyes never leaving hers. Because of you. She reached for his hand, lacing her fingers with his. I didn't plan on falling for you, Nicholas, she said. But I did. Not just for you, but for Liam. For all of you. He leaned in, and for the first time, there was no hesitation. Their kiss was not rushed, not dramatic. It was soft, slow, and full of every unspoken thing between them. It didn't erase the past, but it honored it. In the weeks that followed, things continued to evolve. Sophie remained Liam's caregiver, but also became something more. Someone the school referred to as his emotional anchor. She was invited to IEP meetings, therapy briefings, and even helped create a custom communication board tailored to Liam's personality. One day, Grace, Liam's classroom aide, approached Nicholas during pickup. "Your son is a storyteller," she said with a smile. "He made up a whole story about a flying dog who saves kids from bullies. Said it was based on a dream." Nicholas grinned. "That sounds like Liam. He says the dog's name is Moose," Grace added. They both laughed. But the moment stuck with Nicholas. His son wasn't just surviving anymore. He was imagining, creating, dreaming. He was living. And so, Nicholas made another big decision. He stepped down from his position as CEO of Reed Technologies. The news shocked the business world. Articles buzzed with speculation. Was he sick? In debt? Having a crisis? No one guessed the truth. He was choosing to be a father. Fully, completely. The company would survive. His empire would remain. But his son would only be young once. And Nicholas refused to miss another moment. On a sunny Sunday in May, Nicholas, Sophie, and Liam visited Clara's grave together for the first time. Liam held a bouquet of white tulips, her favorite. He placed them gently at the base of the headstone, then touched it with his small hand. "Hi, Mommy," he said softly. "I miss you." Nicholas swallowed the lump in his throat. Sophie knelt beside Liam. "You want to tell her anything else?" Liam nodded. "Thank you. For my daddy." Nicholas couldn't speak. He dropped to his knees, wrapped his arms around his son, and held him close, the three of them forming a small circle of love in the quiet stillness of the cemetery. As they left, Liam looked up at the sky and asked, "Is she happy?" Sophie smiled. "I think she's more than happy, Liam. I think she's proud." And Nicholas believed it too. Because through pain, they had found purpose. Through loss, they had found love. And through broken pieces, they had built something whole. Summer arrived like a celebration. The garden behind the Reed home was in full bloom, buzzing with bees and laughter, and Liam's laughter was the loudest of all. His world, once confined to quiet corners and medical charts, now stretched across fields of discovery, imagination, and connection. He had come alive in ways that no one, not even Nicholas, had dared to hope for. But what no one saw was that Sophie had been quietly documenting everything. She had started writing about Liam the way she once wrote about fictional characters. Except this wasn't fiction. This was raw, real, complicated life. She wrote about his courage, his meltdowns, his progress in therapy, his terrible knock-knock jokes, his habit of hoarding stickers like they were currency. She even wrote about Moose, the golden retriever whose patience could rival saints and whose loyalty never wavered. It started as a personal project, but Nicholas encouraged her to share it. "The world needs to hear stories like Liam's," he told her one evening as she read aloud a piece titled "The Day My Heart Rolled Through the Living Room in a Wheelchair." So she did. She started a blog. Little Wheels, Big Heart. Within a month, it had thousands of readers. Parents from all over the world wrote in, sharing their own stories, asking for advice, offering support. Some said Sophie's words helped them feel less alone. Others admitted they'd never truly understood what it meant to raise a child with special needs until they read Liam's story. One letter stood out. It came from a man in Texas who had been estranged from his autistic son for years. He wrote, "Your words cracked something open in me. I called my son last night. For the first time in 5 years. Thank you for giving me the courage." Sophie cried when she read it. Nicholas held her tightly, whispering, "You're changing lives, just like you changed ours." Nicholas had changed too. He was no longer the cold, reserved CEO the world knew. He was a man who took Liam to the park every Saturday and helped build cardboard forts in the living room. A man who cried during Liam's school recital, even though Liam only managed to say 3 lines, and then got distracted by the lights. A man who had learned that leadership at home was far more difficult and far more rewarding than running a boardroom. One particularly beautiful afternoon, the three of them attended a community fair hosted by the local therapy center. It was noisy and chaotic, but Liam insisted on going. "I want to show them my new wheels," he had said proudly, pointing to the bright blue rims on his custom chair. There were rides, face painting, petting zoos, and music, and through it all, Liam shone like the center of his own little universe. He even stood, briefly, with the help of braces and a therapist nearby, to toss a beanbag into a game booth. The crowd clapped. Liam grinned. "I win." "Yes, you do," Nicholas whispered, eyes brimming. Afterward, the three of them sat on a picnic blanket, eating melting ice cream cones, when Sophie turned to Nicholas. "I have something to tell you." He looked up. "What's wrong?" She laughed nervously. "Nothing's wrong. It's just, I was offered a book deal about the blog. They want me to turn Liam's story into a memoir. Our story." Nicholas's eyes widened, then softened. "Are you going to do it?" "I want to," she said, "but only if you and Liam are okay with it. It's not just my story to tell." Liam, overhearing, licked his ice cream and said, "Can the dog have a chapter?" They both burst out laughing. Nicholas leaned over and kissed her gently on the temple. "Tell it. The world needs to know what love really looks like." Later that night, after Liam was asleep, Nicholas took Sophie's hand and led her out onto the balcony. The city stretched in every direction, glittering like a sea of fallen stars. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what Clara would want, about what we want." Sophie's heart fluttered. "Okay. I don't want to keep living two separate lives. You're already part of this family, Sophie, but I want it to be official. If that's something you want too." Her breath caught. He reached into his pocket, not with a ring, but with something else. A folded piece of paper. It was a drawing. Liam's, of course. 3 stick figures holding hands beneath the sun. The same drawing from months ago, but now with 4 figures, one smaller, one with floppy ears. The 4th was labeled Baby. Sophie looked up at Nicholas, stunned. "I don't want to rush you," he said quickly, "but I want more of this, with you, whatever it looks like. Marriage, family, chaos, all of it." Tears welled in her eyes. "Yes," she whispered, 1,000 times yes. They didn't announce it with a party or a post. They simply told Liam the next morning. He jumped in his wheelchair, spun around in excitement, and yelled, "I get 2 parents and cake." And that was all the celebration they needed. Months passed. The wedding was small, held in the backyard with only a handful of close friends, and Liam proudly rolled down the aisle holding Moose's leash, both wearing matching bowties. The vows weren't fancy, but they were real. Nicholas promised to never let fear keep him silent again. Sophie promised to keep writing the truth, even when it was messy. And Liam, who insisted on having his own part in the ceremony, shouted, "I promise to love you forever, even when I spill stuff." Everyone laughed, and no one forgot it. Years from now, the world would come to know the story of the Reed family. Not just because of Sophie's book or Nicholas's name, or even Liam's incredible resilience, but because they were living proof that healing is not the end of pain, it's the beginning of love. Love that chooses to stay, to grow, to believe again. And in the quiet of a once empty house, filled now with laughter, spilled juice, dog hair, and storybooks, the final chapter was still being written, one day at a time.